Good morning. Welcome to Watershed. I am here with my trusty counterpart, David Roberts. I am not Blair. Usually, it seems like you and Blair.
Yeah, we got a thing. We're hilarious together. We'll see if Matt can pull his weight this morning.
I have a high bar to get over for sure. Oh, thanks for those shots there. There we go. Oh, there we go. So, real quick, we are not alone this morning.
We are not alone.
I mean, more than just these two wonderful people. Three people. Sorry, Courtney didn't see you back there.
I saw Courtney. Matt didn't see Courtney.
Courtney Allen and Austin. What's your name again? Austin. Yeah, Austin is here with us this morning. But also, we got a few other folks here. This is a part of 10 at 10 a.m. Is it 10 at 10 or 10 at 10 a.m.?
10 at 10. I don't know.
You don't know.
10 at 10. 10 at 10 a.m. is mouthy. So
mouthy?
It's 10 at 10.
All right.
Just 10 at 10.
Sounds good. Well, we've got a few people here who are creating sort of a live audience for us at one level.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's been a while.
It has been a while, and this is what a packed house looks like now here at Watershed. Yep. 6 months since we've been able to do this. Anything new shaking out in your life these days, David?
Well, as I'm sure everyone can feel in the air, we are T-minus 41 days till the beginning of the Christmas season. So Halloween will come fast. Probably somewhere between now and then, I will share my holiday season manifesto with you all once again. I shared it last year. It'll be on Facebook for those of you who don't catch Watershed that morning. But yeah, lots to look forward to.
Yeah, I was thinking more immediate. This morning I arrived at our Watershed offices, and every fire alarm was chirping, every single one. And Taryn had painted all of the fire alarms the same color as the ceiling, so I finally got them, but I had to pry them open, and it was a very stressful morning for me, David.
So what I'm hearing is Matt needs batteries for Christmas.
Yeah, I do need batteries, yes, and a step ladder, because jumping to try to change those, isn't it?
Time out. What did you call those batteries on Slack this morning?
I called them double posts. Thank you very much.
I don't know what that is.
They have 2 posts, double posts. It's not hard.
That's the most Kentucky thing you've ever said.
Oh, trust me, that is not the most Kentucky thing I've ever said.
No, I've heard most of your Kentuckyism.
You've never heard lipstick on a pig? Come on, that's better than double post.
You say that all the time. This was novel.
This is a new one?
This was exciting.
All right, I'm sorry. Double post. Write it down. It's a new part of the what. If you're playing Watershed Bingo, double post is now fair game, right?
He's talking about 9-volt batteries.
9-volt batteries. All right. Enough of our warm-up spiel here. Thanks for coming this morning. And I'm really excited about this series. We're going to get to sit and talk more. But as you're sharing this with your friends, hopefully you're sharing this with your friends. Get your coffee, get your bagel, whatever it is that you need this morning. And I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, we'll see you in a few.
All right.
My name is Mary McAfee. I go by the pronouns she, her, and I've been a member of the Watershed community for about a year when I moved here last August. Really lucky to be involved in such an awesome place. I have volunteered for Greenhouse. I usually am in the 3-year-old room with the willows. It's so cute. There's so many hugs. It's great. And I've also done a few book clubs with Watershed, which has been really awesome. I'm going to lead one this fall with the awesome Rachel Ware. We are going to be doing the Untamed book. So if you're part of that, yay! And if you're part of another book club or you want to get involved, you really should. It's really fun, even on Zoom. It's really fun. So I volunteered to do this before I had a clear idea of what I was going to say. And I decided what's saving me right now? I mean, a lot of different things, but I figured I'd share a little story with you this morning. So about 3 or 4 weeks ago, my amazing partner, Kyle, came to me and he said he wanted a dog. Now, I will preface this by saying we have a dog and she's wonderful. And her name is Hilda. She's a mixed Black Lab German Shepherd and I love her. Hilda, I just saw her online one day, saw her picture on Facebook, and I thought, that's my dog. And we adopted her. And she's around, we think, 4.5, 5 now. So we have a dog. When he asked me we should get a dog, he meant another dog. And I hadn't even thought about getting another dog. Like, there's so many other things on my mind with the world and with job and with life. I was like, another dog, another thing. Why would I do this? So I did the thing that I sometimes do where I was like, cool, yeah, but like didn't think it was very serious. And I kind of thought he'd forget, to be honest, but he didn't. And he later came to me and he said, I found a dog. I said, I'm sorry, what? You found a dog? He had applied for a dog. And I can't be that mad at him because I kind of did the same thing with Hilda when we first got her. I didn't really tell him. I said, I applied for a dog, that we're maybe going to get a dog before really asking. So he said, I applied and they want to meet us. So I was like, oh God, really? He didn't forget. Now I can't get out of this. And I said, all right, well, let's look. You ever adopted an animal before? You know, there's no such thing as just looking at adopting a pet. When you look at the pet, I mean, you basically adopted the pet. And I've done this before. I knew this, but I still agreed to go. And so we meet this dog, and her name is Laika, and she is a big, floofy, beautiful dog. She's around 7.5. I mean, as soon as we met her, I was like, okay, we can get the dog. She's so sweet. Of course, I'm won over by this, but I'm still very hesitant. You know, once we are kind of on this track and we're getting things, I'm still just like, I didn't want this. And I feel so out of control in my life. I feel like I have nothing under control. Why am I adding more to a plate that's already overstuffed? And this ended up in some big discussions with Kyle and I, because Kyle really wanted the dog and I didn't really want the dog. I mean, there's kind of an impasse, right? One of us has to compromise. I can't really tell you how I came to the decision to adopt the dog with Kyle. I think it was just the fact that he really wanted to adopt the dog, and I love him. And I knew, you know, we have a dog. Getting another dog will probably be just as great. Double the love, double the snuggles. And she's been awesome. I mean, she's amazing. She is so sweet and fluffy, and she just sits up next to you and she puts a little paw on you, and it's just so awesome. I'm not going to sit here and tell you everything happens for a reason or that it's perfect now, because it definitely isn't. I mean, she's incontinent, so she kind of pees everywhere. We're dealing with it, you know. But she's an older lady dog, and that kind of happens as you get older. She also puked while I was on Zoom the other day for a staff meeting, just right next to me. And I was like, so like, life is not perfect. Things are not all better now that we have a dog, but she wakes me up every morning and she sits there and she snuggles me and she's very sweet. And she and this whole situation remind me that not being in control of things is okay. 'Cause I like being in control. That's kind of my happy place. And this whole year has been an exercise in me not being in control. It's not always going to be good. It's not always going to be fun. But there are really great pockets in there of me doing things or things happening in ways I never would have imagined, and it being really good. So Laika is how God is showing up in my life right now. I now want to give you a moment to reflect on how God is showing up in your life right now. And thank you for listening. If I see you again in Watershed, please come and say hi.
Remember when you were dancing to that and you didn't think everyone could hear you, but they could?
Double post, David. That's all I got to say. Batteries can be called double post. All right, we're already off track, but Mary, boy, she really did a good job setting this up. The two things that I heard from her are sort of what's creating meaning for me in this series that we're rooting into. There is this feeling of being out of control right now that robs you of your imagination. Those two words surfaced for me when she was talking. And, I know for my own, in terms of my own personal life, wanting to white knuckle things and recognizing that I need something to focus on that reminds me that there's something bigger than me that I'm involved in, even though I can't control that. I can't control everything, every nook and cranny of my life. And I think for the past 6 months, because of the world that we lived in, whether it's COVID or some of the social unrest and the racial unrest that we've been experiencing in the world, like there's a sense that as a community, is there something we can drill down on together that creates a sense of solidarity and has a tendency to undo us a little bit? And I know this parable of the sower has the opportunity to do that. When you were talking about this parable in Reclamation this past summer, that's how this all was born, just so you guys know. During Reclamation, I logged in for a few sessions, and the night that you were going through this parable out of Mark, you were looking at Mark's gospel, I just thought, oh man, like this thing could really live for our community. And then also, I grew up on a farm, and so anything having to do with soil, getting your hands in there, it's just meaningful for me. Just on the front side of this, before we launch in, how is meaning being created for you in this?
Yeah, so like Max said, this was kind of born out of the Reclamation block or class that we did over the summer in the book of Mark. And in particular, we were using a text called The Insurrection of the Crucified by this guy, Theodore Jennings. So if you're curious kind of about the impetus of this, check that book out. Jennings is an amazing theologian. Pretty much anything he wrote would be worth checking out, so kind of shameless plug for him. But yeah, so Matt, you've already kind of alluded to this a little bit, but really it's kind of this paradoxical thing going on here for me. Because on the one hand, we're getting back into the Bible, so to speak. Not, I would argue, that we ever left the Bible or Christianity or Jesus or anything over the last 6 months, as we've been kind of exploring, I guess, the liberation pathway here at Watershed, kind of exploring where God is showing up on the margins, but really explicitly we're getting back to the biblical text. And so on the one hand, it's a return to the familiar, at least for those of us who grew up in the Christian tradition like I did. It's a return to what is for many people a foundational text or a foundational just source of often certainty, to use the word that Mary used, control, perhaps. Comfort. And so yes, we are getting back to the familiar, and yet Mark in general and this parable in particular in many ways are all about a sort of lack of control, disruption, the way that the familiar is made new and unexpected, and it really is a book and a parable in particular that refuses to let us kind of just rest on the comfortable. And so there's a tension in what we're doing right now. Or you're going to hear us use the word tension or paradox a lot this morning. Yeah,
we're going to say more about the false notion of security in the return to the familiar in just a moment. But I know there's a particular context in which we're living today that we've been certainly naming over the last 6 months, and try to name not just at a macro level, but a micro level, because people are going through various challenges and struggles individually, but then also throughout our world. There was a particular context for the readers of this story, or the people who were there hearing that parable. But more specifically, if you were reading Mark's gospel and you hit the 4th chapter and started listening to this story, this parable, what was the context for those folks back in those days?
Sure. So to some degree, we're talking about two contexts. We're talking about Jesus' context, kind of the beginning of the first century, which is we mentioned this a lot actually during our interviews this summer. It's a context where you couldn't separate the spiritual from the political. Jesus lives in an occupied territory of the Roman Empire. There are religious disputes, but those religious disputes are often manifesting as political disputes. And so it wasn't either or for the people in Jesus' time. It was very much both and. So that's kind of going on when Jesus is actually doing his ministry. And then 40 years later is probably when this book, Mark, was written or compiled for the first time. So that puts us around 70 AD. And if you know anything about kind of the history of that region at the time, 70 AD is when the Romans came in and sacked Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. And so Mark is probably the first gospel written, probably not the first book in the New Testament written. That would have been some of Paul's letters, which would have been written in the 50s and the 60s in the first century. Mark is the first gospel written either right before, right on, or right after 70 AD. So the backdrop of this is either the lead up, the event of, or the aftermath of the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, which even for the Christ followers, even for the Christian Jews, because there really wasn't a clear separation between those groups at this time, that would have been a big deal, and that would have been, they would have experienced that as, well, one, as persecution. And Mark's community is probably not in Jerusalem. They're probably in some of the surrounding regions, but they would have experienced persecution. They would have experienced a deep disruption of the hope that they had. Their, unmet expectations probably doesn't even, that probably undersells it. Unmet expectations sounds like, oh, I thought I was getting ice cream today, and I ended up not getting ice cream today. Like much heavier than that. I mean, there was a certain hope that they had in the temple and the expectation that God was going to return imminently, and all of that's kind of shattered.
Yeah, and again, you're doing a great job teasing us for what's in store here in a few minutes. Why don't I read the passage? Let's get into the passage. And one of the things I would invite everyone to do as you show up on in this venue on a Sunday morning, whether it's here or whether it's live or whether you're watching it later, you might just want to pull that passage towards yourself and maybe just use that as a focal point in the weeks ahead and try to hear something through the process of what's being said on stage. I know we're not the only two voices. There's multiple voices that are going to be weighing in on this. I know you're with someone next weekend. Again, we'll talk about it in a moment. But you're going to get a ton of different perspectives as we drill down in this together in the weeks ahead. And so this is the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, verses 3 through 9. And this is Jesus speaking to a crowd of people. And he says this, "Listen, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants, so that they did not bear grain. Still other seed fell on good soil. It came up, grew, and produced a crop, some multiplying 30, some 60, some 100 times." And then Jesus said, "Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear." So I know there's going to be like so many different, ideas or words as people share over the weeks ahead. You and I have spent about 4 weeks talking about this particular morning and how to get us started. And I know I've got a couple of things I'm like, oh man, I think this is really important in terms of factoring in the way that we read this parable or the things that we need to be thinking about. But you go first. Like, what's the thing that someone might want to grab hold of and begin wrestling with as we begin in this first week?
Yeah, so there's any number of things, but I'll go with the one that would have been at least the most kind of provocative or disruptive for me and kind of the way that I experienced this passage growing up. And that's that, and by the way, what I'm about to say, this is probably decent advice for reading any of the parables in the New Testament, but I think it's particularly apt here, is this idea that don't map or don't envision that God is one of the characters in the parable. So in this one, for example, I would have been told that God or Jesus was the farmer or the sower, and I'm saying don't do that. Don't take for granted that you know who God is in this story, and also don't take for granted that God is one of the characters in this story that you can point to and then kind of work everything out from there.
No, so I hear you saying two things there. First of all, if God isn't in the story the way that we've always read God into the story, then what do we do with God? Mm-hmm. And what do we do with us is kind of the thing that surfaced for me. And I also would say, like, that is some radical openness in my estimation. Because if you're like me, you grew up in a culture that wanted to name the reality right off the bat so that you could create the certainty and drill down in the self-confidence that you were, quote, on the right side of things or on the right team or right with God or right with fill in the blank. But say more about this. If that's the starting assumption, then what would be the next click forward then in engaging the text?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think we have to place this parable in its larger context in the book of Mark. So, Mark is unique in a sense among the Gospels, the way that it ends. Whereas I would argue that like Matthew, Luke, and John, kind of the peak or the climax of those stories would be the resurrection account. Mark has a resurrection account, but it's nothing like the other ones. Mark's kind of peak or climax is the crucifixion, where very famously, kind of more so in Mark than any other, is Jesus experiences this abandonment, or this, really that's the best word for it. You know, he cries out to God, and God doesn't show up. And so, you know, Mark is the gospel kind of most associated with this notion of kind of the death of God, or the death of our expectations of God. And literally the resurrection account in Mark, it doesn't end with like them seeing Jesus and recognizing him eventually and then breaking bread or whatever. Yeah. It ends, it's the disciples and the women who are looking at the open tomb. It just says, and they were terrified. Boom, like curtains, like it's over. and
what a warm and fuzzy, right?
Sure. And there is some hope here, and I think we're going to get to that. But so with kind of knowing how it ends and kind of knowing the larger context of this, then you know, it kind of reinforces this notion that the community that is being spoken to here is experiencing a great deal of terror, a great deal of disruption, of like I said, unmet expectations. Kind of the certainty or the hope that they had is being called into question. And so within that context, you know, my argument is that this parable is providing some exhortation, but also some hope and some encouragement.
Well, and the thing that is interesting, because you mentioned Mark ending in sort of it's ending with angst, which like Watershed knows how to do it, some angst, right? Like that's one of the things we excel in is angst around here. But I guess it was a couple of years ago in a series called The Fourfold Pilgrimage, we explored Mark through the lens of suffering. The fourfold progression of transformation is something that is sort of, I guess, not created, but Alexander Shia wrote a book called The Fourfold Progression. And he described how for the first 3 years of Christianity, Christians would come together and they would meditate on the Gospels in this order, Matthew, Mark, John, and Luke, because they understood transformation and healing to take place through different progressions. The first one being the wrestling with the loss of control, which Matthew seems to have many themes around that idea. Then loss of control, which is often described as a death process, leads to great struggle or some metaphorical or real death. Hence, Mark's gospel was the meditative focal point. John's gospel was epiphanic. It's about joy and seeing things from a different perspective. And then Luke, more of a maturity text where, all right, this is what your behavior and this is what your ideas and life should look like in the first century. And so they would meditate through these. It would take them about 3 years, but Shia described how Mark's gospel was the shortest. It's only 14 chapters because you just can't suffer like you can in some of these other stages. So I think that fits with what you're saying here, that these early Christians were, their backs were up against the wall. They had spent decades now in a sense of we have no say-so or no control, which has no relevance for today, right? Like none. I said that sarcastically, but I suppose given that they were suffering in this way, how do you think they were understanding this parable, or how should we start to lean into it then as a sower and seed and all of these things growing? What would be the next click in, you think?
Sure. So, all right. So, can I go back to what I said before? If God's not the sower, if God's not one of the characters in the parable, who's the sower? I'm going to suggest to you we are, or the community. Mark's community is, and if Mark's community was the sower, then that's the closest approximation for us to see ourselves in this narrative or in this parable. So Mark's community is in that sowing position. What are they being asked to do? They're being asked to sow indiscriminately. You know, and so the focus is on the community and their action of sowing. They're not called in the parable to worry about the soil, to worry about who's hearing. In fact, you could almost imagine Jesus saying this flippantly even or sarcastically. Jesus had a sense of humor, I believe. I think that's fair game for us to say. And he closes it by saying, "Those who have ears, let them hear." And I always was kind of raised like that was him like breaking out of the parable and like telling that to the audience, kind of like, hey, if you understand the parable, good for you. If you don't, too bad.
Yeah.
But I actually think we can read that phrase in the narrative of the parable itself. And so, kind of as this one last exhortation, kind of like, no, like, don't worry about the pieces that you can't control. You need to stay faithful. You need to stay faithful with the sowing. You need to stay faithful with the plan. You need to stay faithful with this one thing that I've given you and trust that there is something bigger, more expansive going on that you don't need to necessarily concern yourself with.
Yeah, and it was such a different world back in those days because it was pre-scientific, pre-modern. And so we love us some objective reality, some objective truth. And, trying to have a conversation with a group of people that were enduring immense suffering and living in such a way that you were inviting them to discover, all right, this is the way forward. And Jesus, knowing at one level he's not going to be around to see the end result in all of this. The parables were such great tools because they opened you up and continued to get you thinking about, all right, I got to keep returning this because I clearly don't see it fully the way that I should. Having said that, when it comes to the tension, there's tension in this because the end is not good news for Jesus, according to the way Mark ends. And these people are reading this through struggle. Can you kind of name some of the tensions that either they were feeling or that we might be feeling as we return to this parable in this season that we're in?
Yeah, so, a couple things. So one, right before the end of this parable, when it kind of ends in terror and kind of this deep
Right before the end of the parable or the gospel?
Sorry, the gospel.
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
Good correction. Right before the end of the gospel, there's this youth or this lad that's in Jesus' tomb that people often say is an angel. I don't think it was an angel. If you would have hung out with me this summer in Reclamation, you would have heard why. But we can't concern ourselves with that right now. But there's this lad, this youth, and he tells them, he's like, hey, Jesus isn't here. Go back and you'll meet him in Nazareth in Galilee. And so on the one hand, he's saying kind of go back to the beginning. And so in many ways, this captures the tension that we're exploring here. We are being called to go back to the beginning, kind of go back to the familiar. Nothing new is under the sun. And yet they're going back and nothing is ever going to be the same again. So they're going back to the familiar, but there's this radical change. So that's a piece of it. And the other piece of it is, we're looking at the end of the Mark narrative. We also need to remember the beginning of the Mark narrative, which is the first line is something to the effect of, I'm going to butcher this, but it says, this is the beginning of the good news of Jesus the Christ, the Son of God. And so the whole idea is that Mark is this chapter 1 or is this prologue. And so the reason that it ends with kind of this kind of tension-filled cliffhanger is because, remember, we're supposed to see ourselves as the sower. We're supposed to see ourselves now. The people who are hearing this for the first time back in 70 AD, they already knew who Jesus was. They were part of this community because of that. And so, part of the exhortation here, the encouragement here, the hope here is like, that chapter's over. Now it's time for you to write chapter 2. Or chapter 1 if we're saying it was the prologue, whatever. So kind of the point here, the hope here is this idea that there's this disruption. There's this being robbed or even needing to put to death this notion of certainty, this view of God, this objectifying view of God that allows us to secure ourselves and go back to the familiar in a way that maybe paralyzes us or keeps us in this kind of static or neutral position. And Mark doesn't let us do that. It strips us of our certainty. It strips us of this view of God. I'll go as far as to say it kills this certain experience or kind of projection of God. And in leaving us vulnerable, it opens us up to this radical possibility that something truly new can kind of burst forth, spring forth, or sprout forth, kind of from this position of vulnerability. And it creates the opportunity for a kind of solidarity, I think, that wasn't there before.
Remind us to go back to the vulnerability piece, but I'm getting emotive here because you're describing the world we live in right now, where we want to go back, or we want
we want an ending that is somehow familiar and predictable and safe and good, and we don't know if that's whatever we're going to do. Whatever chapter 2 looks like is not going to look like whatever has existed in the past, I think. And so, like, at a practical level, for someone whose marriage is struggling, or finances are struggling, or there's some other situation that's upending their life right now, like, can I please get some respite? Can I go back to the beginning where maybe there was good news, or at least I remember it that way? And yet the tension is, when it comes to returning to something that we thought we knew was true theologically, the reason we're here at Watershed is because we realized there was something different. There's something more alive, something more disturbing. And so you can't go back. You want emotionally to get back to that place, but practically speaking, the curtain's been pulled back too much. You can't unsee, you can't unlearn, you can't unhear. And two things surfaced for me in that, David, because Rollins talks a lot about this, the death of what we thought was absolute, or he would say God, right? Yeah. And he wrote a book. Peter Rollins, if you've never read some of his stuff, he ruined us a few years ago, really with 2 books, one called The Fidelity of Betrayal, and the other one called The Idolatry of God. And the premise was that he asked the question, do we really believe in God? Are we really having faith in God? Or are we just committed to certain ideas that we have said are true about God? And the most faithful thing you could do, and this seemed really radical at the time, was put to death the things that you thought were true about God, burn it all to the ground, and let something new grow. I'm paraphrasing 2 books. You need to read it to really dive into it. That seems terrifying when you've grown up in a culture that names absolutely certain things are true about God, Bible, Jesus, Christianity, whatnot. But having gone through that experience over the last 4 or 5 years here within this community, that hasn't destroyed my faith. It has actually transformed my faith in ways that I don't know what I would do without, at a personal level. The other thing that I would mention in this, Amy Jill Levine wrote a book. I think it's called Simple Parables or something along those lines. I'm butchering the name. But she leans into this parable, and there it is, Short Stories by Jesus. She's a Jewish theologian writing about Jesus, which makes you want to pick the book up to begin with. But she talks about the tension between the irresponsible nature of the sower in this story. Whether you put God in that position or yourself, there seems to be an abundance of seed. Where in our world, we live in an economy of more scarcity than abundance. We don't see that. We don't know what to do with the idea that seed is endless. But in this parable, the sower is like just letting it rip, man, as though there is no bottom to his seed sack. So those 2 things kind of jump off the page for me when we talk about tension. But is that tracking with you, or how's that landing for you?
No, I actually think those are one and the same point. And so let me explain what I mean by that. So kind of starting with Rollins and this idea that on some level, I'll even go so far as to say salvation. This is maybe a preview for the fall reclamation class, but salvation is in some sense involves that death of God. And that extends beyond the way that we maybe project or understand like God in a theological sense, thinking about doctrines or, different theological accounts of Christ and the Holy Spirit or the Trinity and what have you. But God even beyond that is as whatever it is that we think is going to save us, whatever we think is going to give us, a sense of certainty. So often that manifests in the form of, vocation, relationship, identity, net worth, and things like that. And all of these things are God's. And I'm not even going to say little g, because often, we might say little g God, but we treat them as if these are, big G God. And so on some level, being able to put that to death, kind of having that, I don't know, the language that I use sometimes is kind of being placed outside of yourself. It's alienating. you're being alienated from this identity that you've propped up, that you've created to secure yourself. But there's a freedom in that, because once you've kind of been alienated in that way, you're kind of put in this posture of radical vulnerability. But you realize that radical vulnerability it's collective, it's universal.
Yeah.
It allows for radical solidarity, because you realize, all right, oftentimes this identity that I'm creating myself, it creates these buffers or these walls that I put in place, and I buffer myself over and against the other, and in that,
As though we're in competition with each other.
yeah, which we're starting to get at the scarcity mentality.
Yeah.
And so once that is stripped away, I realize no, there's just radical solidarity. There's just this togetherness in difference. And so if that's kind of the big picture of the book of Mark, then I think we start to understand a little bit about how Mark understands salvation. And then at the level of abundance with this parable in particular, I think Amy Jill Levine is spot on, because if you look at the subsequent parables in chapter 4, because remember, we added the numbers and the verses and the chapters and stuff like that. So all of this would have been kind of like one coherent text or one kind of like smooth narrative. So immediately following the sower passage are this set of smaller parables. You get this one about a lampstand. If you grew up in Sunday school and heard "This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine," this is where we get that song. Jesus talks about a lamp, and if you have a light or a lamp, you put it up as high as you can, so as much light can shine out. You don't cover it in a bushel. I don't know what that is, but you don't cover it up. You want to let it shine. And so, if we're the sower, we're also the light. The next one is another sower parable where he talks about sowing a seed, and the harvest that comes forth is exponentially bigger than the sower or the farmer could have expected or even had any hope of controlling. And then the final one is another famous parable about a mustard seed, and how this tiny little seed kind of creates this tree or this plant that once again is exponentially bigger. It goes far, size-wise, it goes far beyond, that you'd ever hope or expect from this seed. And on top of that, it provides blessing and benefit even beyond the original intent of the farmer. It talks about the animals benefiting from the food and the shade that the tree provides. And so in all of these instances, there's this notion that once you're free to see that there isn't a scarcity mentality, once you're free to see that there isn't a limited amount of this solidarity and possibility that can be found in all this, then it actually frees you to do the little things, to stay faithful, to stay committed in these little acts, not worrying about the big picture, and yet at the same time being, surprised in a sense that God reappears back in the narrative, but by just massively and exponentially, kind of producing this harvest that's greater than you could have ever anticipated or controlled.
And God rarely shows up after the death of Jesus in ways that people could see or could recognize.
Sure. So to your point, I started this conversation by saying don't look for God in this parable. And I actually think if you kind of have been following along this journey, or there's progression with us, if you've been kind of going along with us, I think at this stage, after we've kind of gone through, experiencing the parable and experiencing the broader narrative of Mark without God, I think this is precisely where God can show up again. And just like Matt just said, it's just like all the other resurrection narratives. Mark leaves it more ambiguous, whereas the other Gospels, I think, are kind of like playing with kid gloves a little bit. It's almost like, they're not getting it with Mark. Let's make it more explicit. So in all the other Gospel accounts in the resurrection, no one recognizes Jesus right away. They think he's a gardener or a stranger or a ghost or something like that. And so there's this tension, this paradox once again, a continuity and a discontinuity, which brings us back to that notion of, yes, we are going back to the familiar. And yet everything's different. We're different. We can't unsee what we've seen. And once that certainty, once that idolatry has been stripped away, once we're made vulnerable like that, once that solidarity and that possibility is made available to us, well, maybe then it's time to write chapter 2.
And vulnerability right now is scarce. And I say that not because people aren't in a vulnerable position in the world. I think vulnerability is scarce. I hate to use that word because I don't want to have a scarcity mentality, but when you're living in a time where you recognize the absence of control, your brain, your way of understanding the world immediately kicks into a binary place of fight or flight. And so you're to put yourself out there and admit and be open about, I'm not really sure what's real anymore. And then yet continue to stand in solidarity with those who are suffering. I mean, there is a we're back to the tension. Tension invites vulnerability. And I love that you named how in the mustard seed parable, and maybe someone will expand upon that a little bit more in the weeks ahead. But it's often just this small gesture of vulnerability that unleashes the opportunities and the creativity and the harvest in ways that you wouldn't anticipate. And you look like you have something to say.
Oh, no,
there.
I just want to make sure that I acknowledge the fact that Cedric made a wonderful Hobbit reference a few weeks ago on Labor Day, kind of talking about, being faithful in the little things is what gives hope right now. And I think you have an example of that.
I do. And it surfaced last weekend. If you were here, by the way, if you didn't dial in and watch the 15-year anniversary presentation we did last Sunday, you really owe it to yourself to go back. 6 stories about folks who've been here over the course of our 15 years. And through, vulnerability, now that I think about it, was a thread through all of those. But I guess it was Wednesday night, I reached out to Rich Robles, who was one of the folks who shared his story. And his story was really emotionally charged because of this relationship that he and his wife Jen formed with Mark and Oliver, who are a same-sex couple here at Watershed. And Rich and Jen they weren't used to being part of a community that was fully affirming and fully accepting. This was probably, 5 years ago, 6 years ago. And in the middle of talking in his story, he just broke down and started to cry and was okay. I actually didn't ask permission to put that in there. I asked for forgiveness on the backside. And so I called him on Wednesday. I'm like, hey, how'd you like the video? And he's like, it was good, but I was a mess crying. And I said, what you didn't realize was that last Sunday, Mark and Oliver were both working here as part of our production team. And you're just not going to meet 2 better people than Mark and Oliver. And when you were telling your story, our band was on stage, we had our team in our booth, and those guys are adored. If there's ever 2 people, men in a community that are absolutely adored, it's Mark and Oliver. And our band was unhinged by the story. Your emotion did something in the room that morning to the point where they couldn't hardly sing after that story. And going through that process, they would have had no idea that there was some sort of harvest that would have been created. Mark and Oliver were just being hospitable. Rich and Jen were just leaning into the tension or the disruption. And here we are 6 years later, and it's this beautiful story of transformation. And that's a metaphor, I think, for what we are invited into.
Yeah, so it answers the question, I think, on a practical level as we're kind of wrapping this up this morning. It answers the question of, okay, so what are we sowing? What is that, if we're the sower, what does that look like? And I think that story with Mark and Ollie and with the Robles illustrates it perfectly. It's you're sowing these little postures of faithfulness. It's not this message necessarily. It's not some sort of kind of statement that you have to affirm or pray, in the privacy of your home or something like that.
It can be that, but it doesn't have to be that.
Maybe. But I think more often than not, it's going to be these little acts of solidarity, these little postures of vulnerability and faithfulness, these moments where we press forward or lean in or stand with in the absence of certainty, in the absence of comfort or confidence. And those are the moments that kind of create the bond of love and solidarity that fuels these subsequent chapters that we keep referencing.
So if I'm someone who's watching this morning, or I'm here viewing what's taking place, one of the questions might be, all right, that's all fine and good, but I want more tangibles. And next weekend we're going to take it another degree deeper into the tangible. Can you kind of, without stealing his thunder, can you talk a little bit about who's going to be joining us and why that's going to be really interesting?
Sure. So first off, next week I'm going to be joined by Blair, so we're getting the band back together. But
finally a partner you can rely on, right?
But on top of that, she knows what batteries are. On top of that,
oh gosh.
On top of that, though, we're going to be joined by ethicist and theologian Reggie Williams. And so, like we said, so most of this series is going to be, you're going to be hearing from our teaching team, much like you did with Matt and I today. But next week, we're going to hear from one of my kind of personal, I'm a huge fan of Reggie's work, and Blair happens to be a personal friend. She's the connection here. And so we're going to talk to him about his work, which is largely around the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And if you're not familiar with Bonhoeffer, he's a pretty famous 20th century theologian who is most famous because he was executed by the Nazis because he was implicated in a plot to assassinate Hitler. And how we got that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, kind of the famous martyr Dietrich Bonhoeffer, from the original kind of version of Dietrich Bonhoeffer that existed a couple decades prior, is an amazing story that Professor Williams has a unique perspective on, because it involves some time that Bonhoeffer spent here in America, in Harlem, in New York. And that's as much as I'm going to say, because like you said, I don't want to steal Reggie's thunder, but really, really excited to have Reggie Williams with us next week, and it's really, I think, going to kind of pick up the baton from where Matt and I are handing it off this morning.
So thank you, Watershed. I want to end this morning by praying. Thank you guys that are here, the 10 of you that are in this space. I can't wait to talk to you and just kind of hear what this experience was like for you this morning. 10 more spots, or I don't know if they're open or if they're already closed.
We had a wait list, so there might be a few open, but I mean, like you might already be looking at the following week.
Yeah, for sure. So God, this morning, man, thank you that there are stories. First of all, there's these sacred words, these sacred experiences, these sacred ideas, these sacred truths that help fuel us in our pursuit, our understanding of what it means to become more human, more alive, as we orient ourselves around the Christ, around Jesus, around the idea of the divine. May we approach the weeks ahead with open hands, with an open heart. May we return to the familiar and do that in a new way that wrecks us in all the best ways. And as the weeks unfold, may we become different. And by that, may we become more loving, more whole, more healed, more awake as we struggle together to love a different world into place. We love you, God. Thanks again for this morning. And it's in Christ's name I pray. Amen. Peace out, you guys. Love you. Take care.